Good afternoon, everybody. Getting a little bit of feedback, so just want to make sure our lines are muted. And my name is Susan Barrett, and I am a member of the ISF National Leadership Team, and we welcome you to our last ISF webinar scheduled for this summer, and we're really glad that you're participating today. I'm going to quickly set us up because we have Jessica Swain-Bradway, who is going to lead us today in a conversation around ISF and connecting it to specific restorative practices. So I want to quickly give acknowledgement to our national leadership team. So as we go through today, if you're connected to one of the folks that you see on the screen before you, please don't hesitate to reach out and give us a call as we are increasing our capacity to provide support and training around ISF across the country. Again, we're very excited to have you with us today. I see a lot of familiar names on our participant list and very excited that you were able to join. Today's agenda, we're looking at a 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or a 1 p.m. Central Standard Time start. So we have started on time. I'm going to provide a very brief welcome, and then I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to turn it right over to Jessica Swain-Bradway, who's going to talk about the state of RP, restorative practices in education. She's going to help us define the practices that are anchored and connected to the school-wide positive behavioral intervention support framework. She's going to talk a little bit about assessment needs and provide you some additional resources and opportunities to join a larger learning community specifically designed around helping to support RP in and installing that within a multi-tiered behavioral framework. So that's our overall agenda for today. Many of you have joined us on our webinar series with the System of Care TA network, and I just want to make sure that you all know that these have been recorded. So if you have colleagues or you weren't able to participate on our live broadcast, that you can go back and look in your TA network to get the links to the recordings as well as the PowerPoint presentations. And today's will also be recorded, so we will have you all be able to share today's link as well and download the PowerPoint. In fact, you can download the PowerPoint during our call today, and again, share it with as many colleagues as you guys are building your system for connecting restorative practices into your multi-tiered behavioral framework. So welcome. Jessica Swain-Bradway is part of our PBIS Midwest network, and she is also one of our national partners with our Technical Assistance Center on Positive Behavior Support. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Swain-Bradway.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say I'm really excited to be on this webinar with everyone. I am the Research and Evaluation Director at Midwest PBS. Some of my focuses are particularly high school innovations within high school, including what seems innovative sometimes for high school people, which is the integration of academic and social supports. And I say that very teasingly. I was a high school teacher in a self-contained program, and I did have the distinct pleasure of being able to write with a great group of folks, some of whom are on the call today, on a chapter for the International School Mental Health for Adolescents. That was really exciting. So as we get started, I want to see who is on the call this morning. So poll number 1, that's going to pop up there, and you can fill your responses. Let us know who you are, and we're going to take just a second to give people the opportunity to fill that in. And if you are in a room with multiple people, make sure all those folks get the chance to let us know who's on the call. This gives us a good information for future planning and also for me to frame examples and information as I go through our webinar today. Okay, we're just going to give a few more seconds here, and then we're going to move on to our next survey. It looks like we've got, wow, really nice proportion of you are regional or state representatives. That is excellent. So you are investing in capacity building at that larger scale. Thanks to our School Climate and Aware Grant Site folks for being on this call. We've got some little bit of everybody here. Thanks to our school and community clinicians and our partner administrators. That is great. Okay, let's move on to our next poll. I would like to know how many of you have participated in a previous webinar. Oh, look. Excellent. I'm watching as the numbers go up. I hope all of you are watching as you enter your responses and see how we're breaking on here. Okay, so about three-quarters of you, almost, well, I guess it is exactly, have been on calls before. So thanks very much, Colin. Let's move ourselves on. Okay. So let's set the context and the challenge a little bit here for folks who haven't been on before. We know the core features of ISF are that effective teaming. This is team-based to include community mental health providers. Of course, database decision-making, which is one of the big pieces of a multi-tiered framework in general. Formal processes for selecting and implementation. Instead of the process which often happens, which is, hey, this thing seems kind of neat, I saw it on a website. Early access, really important that we maximize early identification through comprehensive screening. And remember, screening is, how we identify kids who need further assessment, right? And we don't want to identify kids through that. And I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit, but I want to put that out there because I think some of our implementers in the schools and certainly our parents don't always understand the mechanism of a screener. And I know when we're trying to increase access to our young folks and their family members to supports, we want them to understand these different pieces. And that's one of those I see folks balk out a little bit. Rigorous progress monitoring, of course, our level, our rate, our frequency, our intensity of progress monitoring matches the intensity of the interventions. So that way we can do some real-time supports and modifications as needed, or fading when we see supports are being successful over time and we want to fade some of those back. And really important, and something Susan Barrett has been absolutely instrumental nationwide doing is talking about coaching and the importance of coaching, and not just the importance, but the structure. So coaching at the systems level and the practices level. And all of those things are very important to maintain the integrity of the interventions that we pull into the ISF framework. Some of the challenges that we really have kind of I like to say willy-nilly because I've got little kids, but willy-nilly and weak connections, community health providers to schools. We really hit or miss. We operate under a HEROES model, which all of you know. And we need some systematic memorandums of understanding. What are the roles of different people and how they interact? We want our providers to be integrated into teams. I have a sister who is a clinical social worker, has her own practice in the Boston area. And when she first started working with kids, she said, well, there's stuff going on at school. I don't know what's going on. I said, you need to go sit on those teams. And it was really helpful for her. A lot of our clinical providers, mental health providers in schools don't have people telling them to go sit on the teams. And we really want support to across Tier 1, 2, and 3. We don't want to just stick providers in that Tier 3 individualized team. We know there's a lot of work to be done on the preventative end. And so, but those are some challenges that we face in really creating a systematic approach to school-based mental health supports. Other restraints are, we have school-employed mental health staff, very low number. They have, their ratios are below what we would see as optimal and really doable. And they're very narrow functioned. I mean, the problems that we see in expanding school-based mental health are not central. All of them are not central just to the area of mental health, but kind of our organizations of school in general, which are siloed. We depend on HEROES quite a bit, and we're missing those pieces around the coaching and the early identification, the systematic pieces that move us forward, okay? And there are pressures related to gatekeeping, so who's going to get access, who is not going to get access. We also have the barriers of turf. Whose turf is it? Whose job is it? Who gets the opportunity to do those things? There's limited understanding of each other's culture and the work pressures and perspectives, and all of us on this call can see where the collaborative teaming allows for those barriers to be broken down. People are very stressed. Developing new relationships, it's a lot of work for me to follow people around and get to know them without the teaming structure, without the coaching supports. So these are just a few of our challenges. Now, these challenges are not unique to ISF, as I said earlier. They are in part of bringing new innovations into the school, and I think sometimes it's silly to call it innovations because it's just kind of some of the smart work that folks have been doing. But these are not limited, like I said, to school-based mental health. So we're going to use that as our frame to move forward and talk about restorative practices in education. And in particular, we're going to talk about a few different practices that we're seeing more and more commonly being pulled into the educational setting. And so through your ISF lens, what I would like you to think about, and please comment and questions in the chat pod as we move forward. How can you see these practices fitting into the ISF model? I want you to really challenge some of the things I'm saying. I welcome challenges and conflict, maybe an East Coast thing, but I want you to really challenge it and poke holes in this, because right now I'm currently doing work on the community of practice, the national community of practice, specifically on restorative practices. And I think it's our job, collective job, to poke holes in this so that we can do a better job of guiding and providing supports around restorative practices in education. So some of you saw this story, and some of you have seen, this was from last year, and some of you have seen the more recent story where I believe in Kentucky, there was a resource officer called in to handle an unruly child, and I'm doing air quotes, unruly, and the handcuffs, he put a child in handcuffs. The handcuffs were too big to fit around this child's wrists, and so he handcuffed at his biceps. And as a parent, as an educator, that just really sends me kind of off the handle here. But the truth is that a lot of our schools are really struggling with ways to integrate the appropriate level of behavioral supports that meet their needs, the teacher needs, and that meet our kid needs. And let's be very open and honest about the fact that our current disciplinary approach, that's a one-size-fits-all, that we use to address kids who have behavioral issues, kids who have mental health risks, kids who have mental health issues, those are ones that have worked and have been reinforced for a large proportion of our schools, which are teachers. And I will be the first teacher to admit that there were days I was so excited that some of my kids were absent. And then there were days I would say to one of my kiddos, I'd say, hey, Bobby, how come you're just never sick? Do you never need a sick day? So the current practices and systems in place have been in place for some time, and they are reinforcing in a lot of ways. So that negative reinforcement to some of our folks that have to deal with the students that have behavioral challenges. We simply have not yet provided strategies on a broad scale that give teachers something that works in the moment and helps them promote mental health and inclusion in the instructional environment, conveys respect very explicitly, and fosters positive relationships. So this movement that we're seeing with restorative practices, which come from the restorative justice sector and are about repairing relationships, restoring the harm that is done, this is a movement, there's a lot of social validity to this right now. And if you look, you can Google restorative practices right now, and hundreds and thousands of articles will pop up and mention of it on websites, including some of our federal websites. The National Educators Association promoted a package earlier last year on embedding restorative practices into school disciplinary policies. So there's a big wave of restorative social validity. And I think it's really speaking to the fact that people are looking for strategies in the classroom and in the office that simply make their job easier. And for me, it's been easier thinking of systems by thinking about how to teach, model, and reinforce teacher behaviors around these restorative classroom practices. So restorative practices, this is from the Illinois Balanced and Restorative Justice project. Website is down here on the bottom of the screen, and I would recommend for folks that are interested to check them out. It's inspired by the philosophy and practices of restorative justice. It's called Restorative Practices typically in the educational setting. And this is very important for us to remember, it puts repairing harm and relationships above blame and above punishment. And I often say in my high school work that there is no punishment that is as important as maintaining the relationship with this young person. We know that relationships, positive relationships, are a huge protective factor for a lot of our kids that have a variety of origins of issues, okay? The goals of restorative justice in schools we're going to sound a lot like positive behavior support or MTSSB or social emotional learning goals. So there's a lot of overlap. Really to create a restorative, inclusive school climate, so restorative is repairing the harm and putting the focus on relationships. Decreasing our exclusionary disciplinary practices and holding a youth accountable. And I want to put out a word of caution on this one because this is where you can see things start to go awry and go in a very poor direction. Holding youth accountable doesn't mean punishing more and more and more, punishing in a traditional sense of the school. Holding a youth accountable is the instructional frame that we use in positive behavior support through the ISF model. It is our responsibility to teach and to model and to prompt and to reinforce students' school-appropriate and adaptive behavior. And so holding youth accountable for the restorative, in the restorative frame is that we use practices that will teach students, lead them through it, and reinforce this a problem-solving approach to repair and restore what they've done. And that's important for us to remember. Other goals include making sure the person who has been harmed, who has done the harming, and the community in a restorative approach. So when there is an incident at school, a behavioral incident, we will punish the offender. We may or may not talk to the person who has been victimized, and very rarely, if ever, do we reach out to the larger community that may have been impacted. So if there's an event in the class, we are have fairly isolated view of how we redirect or punish a misbehavior. And one of the underlying messages from restorative justice is the importance of everyone's voice in this process. And so you'll see that some of these practices, the two practices I'm going to talk about today, open up the opportunity to include a broader group, to include this individual back, and to heal at the community level. We really want to re-engage our youth that are at risk of academic failure in juvenile justice system. And so we're really going to put a stop in the school-to-prison pipeline. That's one of the goals of restorative justice, is to interrupt that cycle through a dialogue-driven, restorative response. We are really listening to the voices of those involved. Here are some of the concerns that I have and that others around the country are having right now. There's a huge wave of social interest of growing. Everybody wants social justice. Everyone wants social practices in schools. Groups all over the country at the federal level, at the state level, are recommending we all invest in this. We do not yet have solid research in U.S. schools that can be replicated. We have lots of case examples. We have lots of handbooks that have been created and started within the individual districts. But if we think from an observable, measurable frame, well, something that has the rigor to stand up to qualitative or experimental, semi-experimental, all of those things that we're looking for in the research world, we do not yet have that. And we're on our way, but it's not there yet. We're following in the footsteps of this wave of social validity. In addition, we are lacking a standardized fidelity measure. So while there are people that are very excited about this, we're really relying on grassroots effort of very smart individuals and teams at the district levels who are you have principals pulling in restorative practices, and some of them are doing an amazing job, and they're using Swiss in those modifiable, those different optional fields that you can modify in SWIS for Schoolwide Information System to collect information on major and minor discipline referrals. They're saying we're going to use SWIS to tally how many times we use this teacher behavior, this restorative behavior. You have people popping up with these brilliant ideas all over the country. However, other than the restorative practice community of practice right now, which has been in existence for about 4 months, we don't have a national dialogue going on at I think a critical level. We're just now starting that. So a lack of fidelity measure is a problem. You're nodding your heads. I know that Bob Putnam right now is nodding his head and agreeing with me. Here are some current concerns about Schoolwide PBIS, and everyone on the call can now email the National Technical Assistance Center and tell them I have concerns. Schoolwide PBIS, when we take a critical look at it, is very prevention heavy. We put a lot of effort and want a lot of bang for our prevention buck, and that makes a lot of sense. We're decreasing the amount of quote-unquote chaos and uncertainty that children face because we're creating a predictable environment for them. However, the prevention doesn't stop some of these things from happening. A lot of our strategies are to increase what we know, to put in place evidence-based practices and behavior supports. But we are not systematically providing instruction through the school-wide frame in relationship building or conflict resolution. I would like to say, however, that if we look at something like check-in, check-out, which increases positive adult interactions and actually systematically sets up time during the day for a student to interact with a check-in, check-out coordinator, that daily report card that they use, that is a mechanism for building relationships. We don't talk about that within the school-wide language. And I want you all to think a little bit outside of our paradigm, outside of our school-wide paradigm. The restorative world is bringing different language around some of the same concepts. And I think if we can be inclusive, we can help shape restorative in schools to the point where we're not running into for the example I brought up earlier, the caution of holding kids accountable. Holding kids accountable. That sounds like my dad, who I love very much, but he had one strategy for getting me to behave, which was just to get louder. And for those of you that know me, you can imagine that probably didn't work. But we don't talk about relationship building or conflict resolution within school-wide unless we're talking about our kids with higher levels of social need, and we give specific social skill building around those. One of the issues around school-wide is that oftentimes in my work in middle school and high school, that people see school-wide as it's cookies and hugs. It's too babyish for our older kiddos. And we know that that is not the case. However, the range of examples we have provided over time through the National Technical Assistance Center have focused very heavily on elementary school. We're really building out our high school example through amazing work by Bridget Flannery, Jen Freeman, others who are focusing on the high school. We still are bumping up against it's too babyish, it's not sophisticated enough. And a point that Lucille Eber has brought up very eloquently is we are not getting to Tier 3 strategies quickly enough when we're building the school-wide framework. This is a systems shift. And so we're losing kids. She talks about we have to stop the bleeding off the top. We need those kids that have the highest level of need and who are more than 2 feet out the door. We need to be able to engage them quickly. And restorative practices in school is saying we do that through dialogue and through demonstrating respect, through listening to their voices. The intersection of school-wide and RP to me is very obvious. They're both responses to a zero-tolerance approach to discipline. School-wide provides systems to guide adult behaviors at a very basic level. It also provides systems and mechanisms for us to identify and screen our kids, to progress monitor their functioning on a day-to-day basis as we need to, so that we can make real-time decisions and not be trying to play catch-up all the time. Restorative provides additional adult behaviors around discipline that are not exclusionary, okay? They include our students, and they provide the opportunity for kids to restore relationships with our guidance And so and the guidance is us as adults reteaching the behaviors we expect them to see. So of course, ISF is the model for expanding systems, data, and practices. Let me find, I'm looking for something because I'm going to skip ahead. ISF provides that model. And so what I've been able to do through the restorative practice and school-wide community practice, so that's a mouthful, is to be able to, I've used the ISF model to explain how we can start to expand restorative and embed it into the school-wide practices. And Rob, of course, here's my Rob quote, we need to invest in the technology of implementation. And that is very simply what ISF has done. I say very simply, kind of glib. It isn't simple. It's so simple, it's brilliant. But within the RP world, we are, restorative folks don't have a system of care model. Restorative work has been more from the ground up. It's been very organic. And so folks don't have this perspective of a systems or implementation technology. When I'm talking with teams about restorative, a lot of folks want to get on the restorative bandwagon, and I think it's not a bandwagon. I think it's a very legitimate interest and movement, and where I see it working well, it's working really well. But I'm asking teams to identify where this fits. Now, from my training is very behavioral, so what problem are we actually trying to address? And let's match that intervention to needs, right? And that's our evidence-based practice selection and matching. I want to know who's going to use them. So who are our implementers? And then, of course, I want guidance around when we will and when we will not use them. When an individual teacher can use those practices in his or her room, and when that teacher needs to take that information to her or his team. So those are some guidelines that I present. Why is this important? What data are indicating these are needed? And those data may be social validity or perception data from our families. Okay, I'm working with a district right now where the families are saying this is what we want in place. And so we're responding to that family need because we need that family engagement. That is an area of need within our schools, correct? So this wonderful triangle was pulled together by Lucio Eber, Mike Nelson, and Jeff Sprague for an article draft and for a presentation. And we have our continuum. And this doesn't mean that all of these interventions would necessarily be in place within a school. I'm having trouble with there we go. But we have our continuum on the right of school-wide practices and our continuum on the left of potential restorative practices. And in restorative world, we're kind of merging. We're merging both worlds here. So we are promoting the idea of different restorative practices that can be used across our large entire group, across our small groups, and of course at the individual level. And you're going to see a little bit more what that looks like. I'm going to describe these practices in about one more slide here. I really like to conceptualize restorative in my brain. It helps me to think about, it's a person-centered approach because we are using some of these practices to really tune into that individual, really listen to that person. The relationship is very high above blame. We're going to get rid of blaming, okay? We're repairing the damage, and you do that at an individual level. And we're reestablishing that student as a member of the community by knowing where they're coming from and knowing how we can help them fit back into the community at large. We're going to talk about, I'm going to share restorative conferencing and circles, and as a frame, both of them give us the opportunity to establish relationships, a climate of respect, convey the value of every student, you can see with the importance of dialogue, and to avoid power struggles. We are always the adults, even though sometimes I don't feel like one. And we want to make sure we're providing strategies to our teachers as prevention and an appropriate positive response to problem behavior that will not make the behavior worse or exacerbate any of our risk factors or mental health needs. So we're going to put strategies in place to avoid power struggles, to establish relationships. So let's talk about circles a little bit. And I'm glad to see the chat. People are agreeing with me. That's my favorite one. But as I'm going through, please continue to put those questions and comments in the chat box, because I can multitask fairly well sometimes. I have several children. So I can see your comments and your feedback as we go through. Circles are a format and a process for interactions with students and among students. It can be used in both a preventative and a responsive way to teach expectations, to remind of expectations, to welcome. Those are some of our preventative ways we can use restorative circles. And then also for problem solving or restorative conferencing, where we actually add a more formal set of questions to the process of circles to come up with a solution for what went wrong. So we can use circles in a variety of ways. We can use circles to teach content, to provide practice in academic content. So it can be used across from our social to our academic spectrum. And it can be used as a whole class for small groups or for individual students. The format should be the same, regardless of in which school I'm observing. The content will vary. And again, when I sit down with schools, I say, hey, how and when are you going to actually use a circle? Will the teacher use it in the classroom at the beginning of the class? Will the teacher actually interrupt instruction to hold a circle? And for what? Will it be used in the office only? So in the same way within the PBIS framework, we say, what's a classroom versus office-handled discipline issue? This is how I'm thinking of circles. At what point in time do I use this strategy? A caution in my mind as we're pulling new things into the learning environment is how much instructional time am I going to lose? And as we know with behavior management, you often invest a lot of time at the beginning to gain time at the end. I don't want to have kids lose instructional time through a circle process if there's another way to address that issue. However, the flip side is if there is something that's gone in the community or in my classroom that needs to be addressed to clear the air, so to speak, then I want to be able to use the circle and use it well. Restorative conferencing can be used within a circle format with a small group of students if there's been a behavioral incident, or with a kiddo by themselves. And it can be used informally in the classroom by a teacher, or it can be used more formally in the office as part of a planning process to come up with a plan on paper for how a student will repair and restore. And I hope these practices are becoming more and more clear as I'm talking through them. And so I want to make sure that you type in the chat if it is not clear, okay? So restorative conferencing, I had some brilliant women in a large district in Illinois recently tell me about a middle school that just instituted a no public shaming policy for discipline. So you can't yell at a kid, can't go over to a kid and say, what the heck is wrong with you? You need to quietly redirect and using a line of restorative questions, okay? Another brilliant individual who is now at Kent State, Nate Stevenson, had said to me that before they implemented the formal restorative conferencing, they taught teachers and had them practice and held them accountable and watch them for using low intensity classroom management strategies like a quiet redirect and walk away, visual cues for behavioral prompts. And once the teachers had all of those in place, then they had them move on to the informal restorative conferencing. What happened, who was impacted, and how do you make it right? The low-intensity classroom management strategies were helpful to redirect the behavior in the moment and get things moving forward. So the teacher could find a natural break or use, as they're walking the students to the door at the end of the class period, they could use that opportunity to ask them what happened, how they make it right. Some schools are using peace rooms to hold restorative conferencing. Some of them are using it in the office as a more formal strategy. And we, of course, as we layer interventions and we layer strategies, we have the ability to do this with individual kiddos. IBARG recommends this process whenever we're at the point of processing suspensions. And we know that some of our states still have the mandatory suspension offenses, and we're all working really hard on that. But the restorative process for administrators helps build the plan to get that student back into school at the end of the suspension. And one of the things I had a district tell me as they were using and implementing restorative conferencing is that when kids have gone up for expulsion hearings, the students that have done a restorative plan had identified all these different components. What do you need to do and how to make sure it doesn't happen again? And the school part is what can I do as school personnel to help you? When students are going through these expulsion hearings in this one district I have been working with, the students that have restorative plans are much more likely to not be expelled or to have a shorter period of removal from school. So these restorative plans, this is the part of holding the student accountable by teaching them. So you can see where this could go completely wrong with the best intentions, but could go completely wrong if we haven't actually modeled the student what this look like and led them through it. So tell me what happened. Joey, what happened? Joey says, oh. We say, what I observed happening was X, Y, and Z. What were you thinking at the time? I was mad. Yeah, I could see that you, so you would actually walk your kids through this so that they build fluency in this process, okay? So this is the formal restorative conferencing. Administrative teams can use this to develop a reentry plan. How does the kiddo make it right? Who do they need to apologize to? Who needs to apologize to them? How many times have kids gotten in big fights and later on you find out that the kid who was the most aggressive, the kid who got in the most trouble, was responding because somebody said something about her mom, or somebody said something really, really insightful to this kid, like incendiary. There we go. It was an I word. I knew it. But administrators can use this to figure out what actually happened behind all these things. And how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Restorative conferencing can also help us uncover contraindications. Think about maintaining function of a problem behavior. If I am a student who really wants attention, and I figured out, it's really easy to figure out that Miss Brown, my teacher, will call a restorative circle when there's an incident in the classroom so we can all talk about that incident. Well, I might just happen to create some incidents. So now the class stops and everyone's sitting around in a circle and looking at me. If the process is a peer jury in my school that I go to a restorative circle with a peer jury and I want peer attention, that's an awful easy mechanism for me to access, isn't it? So restorative conferencing with an administrator who understands restorative justice, who understands the function-based frame, can help that administrator identify any contraindications so we can avoid inadvertently reinforcing the problem behavior. There are some districts that are investing in something called, an idea called restorative shaming, where we get a kid in a circle and we shame them. We just go through this restorative conferencing process, but, well, shouldn't you feel bad? Don't you feel bad? That's a contraindicated to a positive preventative frame, okay? So it's not just contraindications through a function-based lens. But we want to think about anything that we're implementing, and I'm using this as a bridge to say anything we're bringing into our school, we want to make sure it's not contraindicated to what we know works best as preventative, as positive, and through the restorative frame, through establishing relationships and respect. Pam's asking, how does this fit into an FBA BIP process? That's a great question, Pam. So this may be part of gathering additional information as you're creating your BIP. So when you do function-based assessment and you go through your function-based interviews, your facts interviews, et cetera, and you sit down as a team and you're creating the behavior intervention plan that's aligned with each part of your competing behavior pathway, for all of you FBA gurus out there, you can use a restorative conference and the information gleaned from the restorative conference as part of that plan. The restorative conference should take place very close to, if not immediately following, the problem behavior, because we really want to stop it as soon as we can, and we want to redirect in a positive way and give that kid a plan to deal with it immediately. Have the reparations start as immediately as possible. Restorative conferencing helps us set the kiddo up for success. So we want it to be very clear, the plan to be very detailed. When you create behavioral objectives, they're observable and measurable. As folks are creating their restorative plans to get kids back into the classroom or back into the school setting, we want to think about how clear, how observable these action steps are. Restorative conferencing conveys respect and collaboration by including the voices of all around the table who are going to help. Definitely not just does it communicate you belong, it's actually strategizing how to get you to belong. It's not, when we talk about a continuum of discipline within Schoolwide PBIS, I think people think it means varying gradations of how to get a kid out of my class. And some of you are probably snickering about that, rightfully so. We want to communicate explicitly, not just in our policies, but in our day-to-day practices, how kids belong. And all of you are on this call because of your investment in kids belonging and your understanding about the importance of relationships and respect to build and maintain those relationships. We need our kids who have the highest risk factors, and the kids who have the most level of need to be closest with us. We want all of our staff to agree to follow this reentry plan, this restorative planning. So Tim is saying, what's the experience working with restorative conferencing and the contraindications the speaker was discussing? What is the experience? So Tim, what I'm speaking to is what I've seen and I've had reported to me from districts who are doing restorative-ish or PBIS-ish. So they're taking these ideas and they're, instead of working with restorative trainers who would be able to help them navigate through some of these murkier areas or areas they don't have experience with, they're doing things like the restorative shaming. Or the teachers are pulling together circles to address a problem within the classroom again and again and again, and that problem is again and again originating with a kiddo. And when the teams are doing an FBA, then they're saying, well, there's a lot of tension from the circle process. So you can see that, and with lots and lots of different strategies, you can implement them in a way that is not in keeping with what we know about prevention and establishing positive environments. So I really push our schools, that was a great question, I really push our schools that are doing this and our districts to think about, when, like I said before, when do you use it, when do you not? How do we document its use so we can make real-time decisions? And how are we documenting outcomes? Our student outcomes, our perception data. Those outcomes could be teacher stress. Those outcomes could be family engagement. How engaged are the families? Are they showing up at these meetings? Are they reporting they feel supported? I really want us, as has happened with ISF, to have documents for schools and districts to use that dictate when and how these will be used and are cautions. And I think dictate, I don't want that to be a really strong word, but will outline what we think are best practices. Now I have to say what we think, because while I've created a logic model for restorative within schools, we still have to caution with, we do not yet have a bulk of evidence in U.S. schools that shows us the right way and quote-unquote wrong way to implement. How do I adopt a zero-tolerance school district to adopt RP? Well, lots of people like chocolate, and then lots of other people like cookies, and then some of us like whiskey. So I'm kidding, John. This is a big issue for all of us. And we know that the federal government came out in 2012. Arne Duncan made an announcement. Kicking kids out of school is an abuse of their civil rights. There's a big push, a lot of things coming out through the Department of Education, very strongly worded and very convincing that we need to get rid of zero tolerance. And our buy-in, I think buy-in is actually two different questions, and Bridget Flannery had pointed this out to me several years ago. Buy-in is a question of, is there a problem with current practices? And the other question is is this approach the best way to address that? And so uncovering the answer to those two questions will give you insights to the types of tools you need to utilize, how quote-unquote heavy-handed or organic do those tools need to be. So some of the decisions around restorative with our teams and our schools is what practices do we need, who will use them, and when will they use them. So what I want to know really quickly is if you are using circles or restorative conferencing in your district, can you please come up to the top right here above the word feedback? There's a little person with her or his hand standing up. So I'm going to turn mine on. If you have a school that's using either one of these practices or considering using this, put your hand up for me. Good, good. Good handful here. Excellent. Thank you. You can put your hands back down. Let's see who can figure out. I think Dave can. There we go. Oh, Dave, you're the last one. There we go. We got it. Nice job. Have you considered how you know these things are being used? Are they being used as intended? So we haven't talked about this yet. I'm kind of doing a misrule in teaching. I'm going to ask you a question before I talk about it. But what are some ways, think about the ISF frame, what are some ways you would know if practices are being used as intended? So please take a moment and chat and write, given what I've talked about, what would potentially be some ways to know that practices are being used as they're supposed to be used? Phoebe, there is some research from Australia and some European countries of effectiveness in other countries within school. Yep, Pam, a rubric is a great idea. And thank you. I see multiple folks are providing feedback, and I appreciate that. It's always much more interesting when you... Yes, Nancy, I love observation. That's really important. And think about how I discussed earlier the idea of coaching. Your coaching for restorative work can be a community provider. However, we know, as with many things, we want to build internal capacity to the best of our ability. So we don't want to just rely on that external provider. We have improvements in the classroom, improvement in groups, individuals. There are certain problem behaviors we would anticipate that would get better if we're really establishing these relationships, if we're using increased opportunities to engage kids in relationship building, in being able to identify what's gone wrong and how to fix it. We would think that theoretically harassment may go down between peers, disruption may go down, disrespect may go down. Nancy, I knew you didn't mean rubric. I knew you meant rubric. So thank you for those contributions. Remember, when we are assessing fidelity, we want to make sure it's accuracy as well as the rate or frequency or kind of responsiveness. Am I using it correctly, and how often am I using it? And some of our guidelines around fidelity is, well, there was supposed to be some fly-ins here, but that didn't happen. But so just ignore that it says, please respond in the chat pod. That would be my problem with organization. When we assess fidelity, if it's a new skill, we assess more frequently. We know this. As folks at the broader level of capacity building, we need to make sure we're facilitating building of those systems that will allow us to do this. What are the systems we need in place? And then what are the systems we need to fade the frequency of fidelity as a person is able to use that practice well? And we modify our teaching, we modify our implementation, and we use it at the whole school, the grade level and teacher level. So we want folks to, for those of you at the planning level, at the resource level, we want you to think about how you support building of the systems to do this, and that how we actually get it to our implementation teachers level. So as you're developing your checklist or your rubric, because right now, as I said, we don't have a resource We don't have a fidelity resource that's been vetted broadly. I actually have one right now that is being vetted. And so if schools are interested, my districts and all of you at the district level and above are interested, my email address will pop up at the end and we can come up with some agreements on how we're going to use that. But in schools right now, as you're pulling in these, people are pulling in these practices, I want, again, the systems level rule, when are we going to use these practices? And I'm really pushing, I work with some RP coaches in Chicago public schools, and I asked them to describe what they wanted people to do in an observable and measurable way and create a rubric so that our coaches were going in to teach and train, and they had this rubric for people to use. Okay. At the systems level, we know we have the tiered fidelity inventory, which assesses our 3 tiers of the multi-tiered PBS system. At the individual level, as teams identify and select those practices with their restorative coach or trainer, I want them to come up with an observable, measurable definition. What are the 3 things I'm going to see, or the 5 things I should always see? And I'm really kind of pushing people back to the special ed world of task analysis. That's where I'm coming at this from. What would I undoubtedly see if I was observing this? And what would be the outcome I would expect to see to go along with this? Very observable. So here is a snippet from the fidelity draft that is currently being vetted. It's gone through Chicago Public Schools, San Francisco Unified, and Portland Public Schools in Oregon. And so if you have large districts that are investing and they would be willing to use and share, please let me know. Again, my email will pop up here at the end. But this is what I'm talking about in terms of observable and measurable. We've agreed. Classrooms are used in both, circles are used in classroom and non-classroom. They're used for welcoming. They're used for restoring harm. They have been aligned to school-wide expectations or circle guidelines. Again, we want this alignment. We don't want separate things, which is why we say let's have expanded teams so you get your restorative coaches on the various teams so that they can provide that feedback in the same way that our mental health providers are on those various teams. This is an agreement, right? We want to know that schools have this agreement. So restorative circles or circles to repair harm are co-facilitated by the coach or administrator. So this is one of those items, as well as 2 and 3, that are part of the negotiables for how we pull this into school. Is this what it looks like? And then students have contributed to establishment of circle values. This is very important, the systematic inclusion of different voices. So these first 6 items are about the process. And then this is about the actual application of the circle. So once I'm doing the circle, the purpose is clearly stated. The circle consistently states circle guidelines. This will be part of the observations that Nancy had talked about. Here's our rubric, in place, not in place. Circle keepers identified at the beginning of the circle. Now, it can be a staff or student. Does not have to just be a staff member. There's a talking piece used, and all participants have the opportunity to speak in turn. Okay, so these are just a snippet of the fidelity draft around circles. So thank you for putting your thoughts in the chat box as we go through. Oh, a data source. Thank you for the question. So a data source, Pam, you know all things in PBS and in ISF should live on some kind of document so that you can be absent, I can be absent, and that it exists. So the data source may be the student handbook. It may be the circle rubric that is in the teacher materials, et cetera, et cetera. So assessing the outcomes, when we're expanding our system and we're including our restorative work, restorative strategies, we want to make sure we are in some way assessing the outcomes, and what we assess depends on where our attention needs to be. What are our data telling us? And these could be, again, data from the community that indicate a level of need, or data within the school, within our school records. So we may be looking at a variety of outcomes. I definitely believe we should be assessing our impact on instructional time. How much time are we preserving or creating or losing? And are we okay with losing some time at the onset to get what we perceive as benefits on the outset? And so what's that cost benefit? We want to examine that. All of these different things, again, may be things that may be outcomes that we're interested in, peer interactions, feelings of belonging, adult responses to problem behavior. We know that office referrals are a proxy for student problem behavior because it's a teacher behavior. Writing a referral is a teacher behavior. And so we want to be able to look at, we want to be able to assess adult responses as accurately as possible with student outcomes in mind, right? We want to get closer, we want to use a low inference measurement versus a high inference measurement. These are other things that we would anticipate folks would want to have an idea of the outcome. It's important that we are keeping in mind the impact on our disciplinary consequences. Again, some of our states have, you have suspendable offenses, you have to suspend kids for them. And we also want to look at things that are systematic and kind of part of the process is, are we using a peace room? Do we need a peace room? Okay. And it was a word of caution about the peace room that's not related to outcomes. I want to caution all of us all the time from removing a kid from an environment to correct the problem. We know that's a big no-no in a lot of ways. Some schools find the peace room very effective for things like peer juries or restorative circles that are necessarily larger and involve a number of people, and to be scheduled after school hours because it's very difficult to pull them all during school hours. So I've seen peace rooms used that way. We would eventually hope to see a shift in our attendance and grades if we're keeping more kids in school and we're keeping more kids engaged in content because we're using restorative strategies to establish and maintain a relationship. And we're using restorative conferencing to teach students to think about the consequences of their action, but in terms of making them right, putting it right, correcting and repairing. Then we would expect to see over time a shift in some of these outcome data for our kids. There are different ways for us to assess perception data and outcome data. You are probably more aware of, of some of these outcomes and perception data and these organizational survey data than I am. Something to point out, this Georgia Climate Survey is really looking pretty sharp. It's just the 11 items. Schools are also doing some of school developed, and what we're seeing in restorative practices world and language are a lot of data around perception of the environment, of the relationships, and in a lot of cases, so just so you are aware, those perception data and surveys are being touted as fidelity measures, and there is just a difference in language between fields of education and mental health and restorative practices and restorative justice. So if schools are saying we want to implement this, I'm really asking them to look at what the items are assessing and to use it for what's intended for. Perception data, perceptions of fidelity are one thing, but asking if you feel like you have a good relationship is not a fidelity measure, it's perception for that climate. We want to really encourage, in the same way as we're thinking about school mental health, we want our folks to be linked into reputable providers. In Illinois, we have IBARG, Illinois Balance and Restorative Justice Project. I had mentioned them earlier. They have a list of regional trainers on their website. You want this coach to be able to help with how you want to expand the school-wide frame, expand what you currently have available to students to maximize in this teaming structure, to maximize your screening, your progress monitoring. Your coaches, I'm finding that a lot of restorative coaches, even without a school-wide background or an educational background, are able to come in, they share their expertise, and as a team, we're seeing a very expanded approach. And we wanted a strategic plan. As you're developing your strategic plan for expanding to schools and in the district, I'm asking folks to think about how do you expand your coaching as well, and what does it look like? I've got some great examples of very large districts in the U.S. right now that are expanding their coaching and their RP expertise at the district level, and that's where they're starting versus starting by implementing in schools. I think it's a really smart approach for us to be building those systems. As always, I know I'm preaching to the choir, the intensity of the coaching needs to match the intensity of the intervention, and I'd also like to for us to think about the newness, not just the intensity, but the newness. If this is a zero-tolerance district that Tim had brought up earlier, I believe it was Tim, so I'm sorry if it wasn't, but if this is a zero-tolerance district, you really need to almost bombard them lovingly with coaching. A restorative coach in Chicago said to me, if we could just send all 40 of us in this room to that school right now for 2 weeks, we'd be great. And people kind of chuckled. I said, you are absolutely right. So inundating, immersion, really in matching that intensity, and also understanding the pushback. Is it a question of is there a problem? Is this a problem? You're going to find in a lot of districts there may not be a problem with exclusionary discipline from their perspective, right? The problem is there actually is a problem, and we can document what those issues are. And also understanding where they are on the continuum of if there's a problem or not, as well as the continuum of is this how we address that problem. So what I'd love is to get some feedback. I believe we're scheduled for 90 minutes. I hope I'm not wrong. But I don't have much more. I'd like your feedback in the chat pod. What was the most relevant information you heard today? What are you going to do with this information now? As well as, I'll add one, what else do you need to know? And I will do my best to answer those questions. I'm going to give people a chance to write feedback in there. What was interesting? What's most relevant? What are you going to do with that? As you're doing that, I want to point out that there are webinars that are upcoming for the Restorative Practices Community of Practice. I'm going to put my email address in the chat box. If you are interested, please contact me. We would love to have you on there. I want you to be part of this conversation that's going on. Your perspective and feedback from the mental health view is really helpful. We have more voices at the table, then we will be able to really address the different issues. And I want to say thank you very much for attending. I see people are still typing, so I'm going to say thank you. I also want to read out some of this feedback. Yes, we need some guidance for implementing RP, not just training school personnel. We know that training and hoping is training and hoping. We want to have those structures in place, very much in the way we have structures in place to implement with fidelity school-based mental health approaches, preventative as well as responsive. Thank you, Tim. I appreciate your thinking about the contraindications. That is definitely something for us to explore at a systematic level with our district folks as well as at our school. And we know if we can predict it, we can prevent it, right? I'm going to borrow a little bit from PBS world. So if we can predict the difficult parts, then we can come up with systematic ways to address it before it happens. And that's my preference as we're rolling these things out versus trying to recover. Should RPB require teacher training or annual teacher education? John, I think disciplining with dignity, any strategies that we can use to help teachers discipline with dignity and making sure they understand evidence-based practices in classroom management should be absolutely mandatory. And I think restorative takes us a little bit past that We don't have the evidence around it yet, but we do see high levels of teacher satisfaction and kid satisfaction. I think those are worth investing in. This is great feedback. Therese, I think in terms of how long circles need to last is dependent on the content and the process that's being expected. There's a school district in Champaign area that does circles for 10 minutes every morning for welcoming, reminding of school-wide expectations, and occasionally teaching second step or other SEL social skill pieces. So the function is going to match the time, and that's going to match the need from your student group. So Teacher Center, this is an issue with teachers don't always feel as though they have the time, and so we were going to create some for them. Also, I want you to think about how you implement new things. We don't necessarily need to make everybody do it at once. We create a handful of people that are willing to engage, that are willing to advertise, that are willing to share their successes, and that are going to make this move, and we build from there. We share their data, we share their successes. And so we think about going slow to go fast. Yeah, Eileen, it is really important for us to be considering voice and how to get this into our day-to-day. No shame, no blame. I have a district that said they use the restorative philosophy to really engage their teachers, to really get people on board. It was very appealing. And then from there, they were able to work backwards and start installing multi-tier framework, PBS framework. So is this webinar going to be available online? That is a question for our tech support. I believe so. It's recorded, and I will get an email that gives me the link. We will begin posting this. I believe we're going to post it in several different locations.
That is correct, Jessica. We will be posting it in several locations at the Midwest PBIS.org and also on the System of Care Technical Assistance site.
Great. And Sharon's asking, thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate you jumping in here. I know you are a busy lady. I'm going to go back, and these are the dates of the upcoming webinar for the Restorative Community of Practice. So you guys can be on like 10 different community of practices if you want. That's okay. I love it. I get to hear all the good things you have to say and all the excellent comments. And I promise if I use something you wrote in the chat, I will mention your name. So this is all really good feedback and pieces that you're taking with you. I am going to wrap us up and say thank you very much. There are upcoming webinars and topics. I also really need to point out that October 22nd and 23rd, we have the October Forum, the Technical Assistance PBIS Forum. There will be 2 sessions and a roundtable discussion on restorative. And I would love for all of you who are interested to be part of that and be part of leading those small group discussions. We are going to be generating some suggestions and some cautions and putting some more things on paper as a result of those discussions. So we also have our School Mental Health Conference coming up in New Orleans, November 5th through 7th, and there's a website right here if you want to check that out. So get linked into these exciting events going on. Please send me an email if you have any questions or concerns or looking for additional resources. Healthier San Francisco. Let me find the website. There's a great website on from San Francisco School District. I'm going to paste that right in here. They have some excellent resources, and they're getting closer to I feel like a really operational handbook than anyone else. So if you're looking for operationally defined, that's a good place to start. And please make sure you keep in touch with questions or concerns. So thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you so much for your time and your resources and the lessons learned thus far in the process. And thank you so much for inviting us to join the professional learning community for RP and PBIS. Really appreciate everything you brought to us today.
Oh, thank you, Susan. I appreciate the opportunity. We're all full of appreciation.
Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for participating today, and we look forward to hearing